The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood why. I am Yarvin Oss, a registrar for the Confederacy Expansion Office, and on that day my job was simple. Walk into a small human settlement called Brightholme, present an annexation notice, and collect a signature. That is all. I had done this on 11 other worlds. 11 times the local leaders bowed their heads, signed where I pointed, and accepted that their world now belonged to the Confederacy. I expected the 12th to be the same. The human governor who met me was a woman named Laura Bennett. She wore a plain gray coat and stood with her arms folded, watching me the way a person watches a storm cloud they are not yet worried about. Behind her, the settlement looked unremarkable. Low buildings, quiet streets, children playing near a fountain that had stopped working years ago. Nothing about this place suggested danger. Nothing about it suggested anything at all, except that it was small and far from any major trade route, which was exactly why my superiors wanted it. Cheap land, easy minerals, no resistance expected. I held out the data tablet with the annexation seal glowing on its surface. By order of the Confederacy Council, this settlement and its surrounding territory are hereby claimed as Confederacy property. Sign here to confirm transfer of governance. Laura did not reach for the tablet right away. She looked at it, then at me, then past me at the small escort ship parked on the landing pad, its hull barely large enough to carry 6 soldiers and a pilot. I remember thinking she looked almost amused. "You're serious," she said. "Completely," I answered. "Refusal is not a registered option in this process. I am simply here to record your signature." She laughed. Not loudly, not in anger, just a short breath of disbelief, the kind of laugh a person makes when something so absurd happens that there is nothing else to do but laugh. Then she took the tablet from my hand, signed her name without hesitation, and handed it back to me. "There," she said. "Congratulations. You just declared war on the most deadly species alive." I stared at her, waiting for the rest of the sentence, the part where she explained the joke. It never came. She simply turned and walked back toward the settlement, leaving me standing there with a signed document and a phrase I did not understand. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it matters for everything that came after. I felt nothing close to fear. I felt mild confusion, followed by faint annoyance. Humans were a recently cataloged species, barely a few decades into space travel by our records. They had no listed warships in the Confederacy registry, no notable military history beyond their own homeworld conflicts, and no allies among the recognized galactic powers. By every measure my training had given me, humans were what we called a Tier 3 species, manageable, predictable, harmless beyond their own borders. So I filed her words under bravado, a wounded statement from someone who had just lost control of her home and wanted to feel powerful for one more sentence before reality set in. I returned to my shuttle, transmitted the signed documents to Confederacy Central, and noted the incident as routine in my report. I even added a line recommending that future registrars be prepared for minor verbal resistance from human subjects, as if it were a quirk of the species, like a strange accent or an unusual greeting custom. I did not think about her words again for 6 days. On the 7th day, I was reassigned to the orbital station above Brightholme to oversee the transition of local infrastructure into Confederacy systems. It was tedious work, mostly digital, mostly silent. I spent my hours reviewing resource extraction schedules and population registries, occasionally glancing out the viewport at the pale blue curve of the human world below. It looked peaceful. It looked like nothing was wrong. Then the sensors changed. I was not on duty when it happened, but I heard about it within minutes, because everyone on the station heard about it within minutes. A contact had appeared at the edge of the system, far past the orbit of the outer planets, moving in a way our tracking systems struggled to classify. The first report called it debris. The second report called it an anomaly. By the third report, someone had stopped guessing and simply called it unidentified, which on a Confederacy station is a word that makes people very quiet very quickly. I remember walking to the observation deck because I wanted to see it with my own eyes, rather than read about it on a screen. A dozen other staff members were already there, crowded near the windows, murmuring to each other in low voices. Someone had pulled up the sensor feed on the main display, a single point of light against the black, motionless according to our instruments, which made no sense for anything moving at the velocity it had just been tracked at. "It's not responding to hails," one of the technicians said. "Not military code, not civilian code, nothing. Run it against the registry again," someone else said. "I have." 3 times. There's no match. I should have felt afraid then, looking back. But fear requires understanding what you are afraid of, and none of us understood what we were looking at. We had no context for a vessel that did not match any known design, moving in ways that defied easy explanation, sitting silently at the edge of a system we had just claimed. So instead of fear, what filled the room was a kind of nervous curiosity, the sort of feeling you get when something strange happens but you assume someone smarter than you will explain it soon. I went back to my quarters that night and tried to sleep. I kept thinking about Laura Bennett's face when she said those words. Congratulations. You just declared war on the most deadly species alive. At the time I had dismissed it as the kind of thing a defeated person says to feel less defeated. Now, lying in the dark with the image of that motionless point of light still in my mind, the phrase felt different. It felt less like bravado and more like a fact she was simply stating out loud, the way someone tells you the weather before you step outside. I told myself I was being foolish. Humans had no warships. Humans had no allies. Humans had barely left their own solar neighborhood before the Confederacy found them. There was no version of the future where a single unidentified contact at the edge of a recently annexed system represented any real threat to an empire that spanned thousands of worlds. I believed that completely, right up until the moment everything changed. The next morning, Station Command called an emergency briefing. I was not senior enough to normally attend such things, but my report on the Brightholm annexation made me, apparently, a relevant witness. I sat near the back of the briefing room as the station commander, a stern Confederacy officer named Director Sale, pulled up updated sensor data on the main screen. The contact has not moved, Sale said. It has not responded to communication attempts. It has not displayed any weapons signature we recognize, and yet, he paused, and I noticed his hand tighten slightly around the edge of the podium. And yet 3 of our automated defense satellites in the outer system have gone silent in the last hour. A murmur ran through the room. Define silent, someone asked. Offline. No distress signal. No debris. No explanation. They were functioning normally, transmitting standard telemetry, and then they simply stopped. I felt a small, cold knot form in my stomach. I thought of the registrar's report I had filed 6 days earlier, the line about minor verbal resistance from human subjects, and how foolish those words now felt sitting in my memory. Sale continued. We are treating this as a potential security incident. All non-essential personnel are to remain in designated zones. Defense systems are being placed on alert status. I want it understood that we do not yet know what we are dealing with, and until we do, caution is mandatory. I raised my hand, which surprised even me. Sale looked at me with mild irritation, clearly not expecting questions from someone of my rank, but he nodded for me to speak. During the annexation of Brightholm, I said, the settlement's governor made a statement to me directly. She said, and I am quoting precisely, "Congratulations. You just declared war on the most deadly species alive." I documented it as a defiant remark, and did not think further of it. Given recent events, I believe it may be relevant. The room went quiet, in a different way than before. Sale's expression shifted, the irritation replaced by something more careful. You filed that as routine, he said. I did. I had no reason to believe otherwise. Human military capability was rated Tier 3 in our registry. There were no listed warships, no known allies, and no record of conflict beyond their homeworld. Our registry, Sale repeated quietly, almost to himself, was apparently incomplete. He turned back to the screen, where the single unmoving point of light still sat at the edge of the system, patient and silent, like something that was not in any hurry at all. I remember staring at it and feeling, for the first time since arriving in this system, a genuine chill move through me. Not because of what the ship had done. It had done almost nothing visible, but because of how calm it was while doing it. There was no posturing, no aggressive maneuvering, no attempt to frighten us with displays of power. It simply sat there, and 3 of our satellites had gone dark, and somehow that silence felt far more dangerous than any show of force could have been. I thought again of Laura Bennett's calm voice, the way she had said those words without raising her voice, without anger, almost as if she were simply informing me of something true, rather than threatening me with something false. At the time I had mistaken her calmness for weakness, the resignation of someone who had lost and wanted one final moment of dignity. Now I wondered if I had mistaken something else entirely. Perhaps her calmness had not been resignation at all. Perhaps it had been certainty. Over the following hours, The station shifted into a kind of controlled tension I had never experienced before. Officers moved quickly but quietly through the corridors. Communication channels buzzed with updates that arrived faster than anyone could fully process. Defense crews ran diagnostics on weapons systems that, until that week, had never needed to be more than decorative deterrents against a species we believed incapable of real resistance. I returned to the observation deck twice more that day, drawn by something I could not name. Each time, the point of light remained exactly where it had been, unmoving, unbothered, asking nothing of us, and offering nothing in return. It was the stillness that unsettled me most. A predator that rushes forward, tells you it is afraid of losing its chance. A predator that waits, perfectly patient, tells you it already knows it has already won. By the time I finally returned to my quarters that night, the knot in my stomach had not loosened. I sat at the edge of my bed and replayed the moment on Brightholme over and over in my mind. Laura Bennett's calm face, her short laugh, the tablet passing from her hand back into mine. I had walked away from that exchange feeling nothing but mild irritation at a human's stubbornness. I had filed it as routine. I had moved on. I understand now how wrong I was to do that. I understand now that her words were not bravado, not defiance, not the empty threat of a defeated governor trying to salvage one last moment of pride. They were a warning, delivered as plainly and honestly as anyone has ever warned me of anything in my life, and I had been too confident, too comfortable, too certain in my own understanding of the galaxy to recognize it for what it was. "Congratulations," she had said. "You just declared war on the most deadly species alive." I did not sleep that night. I lay awake listening to the quiet hum of the station around me, thinking about that single, silent ship at the edge of the system, and wondering, for the first time since I had begun this assignment, whether the Confederacy had any real idea what it had just done. 3 days after the unidentified contact appeared at the edge of our system, Director Sale ordered a full reconnaissance sweep. I was not meant to be part of that mission. My role was translation and documentation, not field operations. But because I was the only person on the station who had spoken directly to a human before the incident began, Sale decided my presence might prove useful if communication became necessary. I boarded the reconnaissance cruiser with a strange mixture of professional duty and quiet dread, neither of which I voiced to anyone around me. The cruiser carried a crew of 40, all trained Confederacy personnel, supported by an escort of 6 smaller defense vessels. Compared to the single, motionless contact at the edge of the system, our formation looked overwhelming. I remember standing in the observation bay as we approached, watching the tactical display fill with our own ship icons, arranged in a precise, confident formation, and feeling a small measure of relief. Surely, I told myself, this show of strength alone would be enough to settle the matter peacefully. Surely a single vessel, regardless of its origin, would not challenge an entire battle group. I was wrong, and I would spend the rest of that day understanding exactly how wrong. As we closed the distance, the human ship came into clearer view on our sensors. Its shape was unlike anything in our registry, long and angular, built without the smooth curves and layered shielding that Confederacy vessels favored. It looked almost unfinished, as if function had been chosen over appearance at every possible turn. There were no visible weapon ports that matched anything in our threat database, no glowing energy cores, none of the usual signs that told a trained observer a ship was prepared for confrontation. If I had seen it without context, I might have mistaken it for an old cargo hauler left adrift. "Hold formation," the cruiser's captain announced over the comm. "Attempt contact on all standard frequencies." I watched as the communication officer cycled through channel after channel, repeating the same standard greeting in every Confederacy dialect we maintained, along with the few human linguistic patterns we had on file from prior limited contact. No response came. Not silence exactly, because our systems registered that the messages were being received, acknowledged even, but no reply followed. It was as if the ship was listening carefully and choosing, quite deliberately, to say nothing back. "They're reading our transmissions," the officer confirmed. No response. The captain ordered us closer, slow and controlled, maintaining formation discipline. I remember the tension in the observation bay growing with every passing minute. Not because anything dramatic was happening, but because nothing was happening at all. The human ship did not move. It did not power up any visible system. It simply sat there, watching us approach the way a person might watch a door they already know is about to open. Then, without warning, every screen in the observation bay flickered. It was such a small thing at first that I almost dismissed it as a routine glitch. A flicker, a half-second of static, then the displays returned to normal. But within moments, reports began arriving from across the cruiser. Navigation systems were reporting conflicting position data. Communication arrays were picking up interference patterns that matched nothing in our defensive countermeasure library. One of the escort ships reported its weapons targeting system had locked onto 3 different friendly vessels simultaneously, despite no command authorizing such a lock. "What is happening to our systems?" the captain demanded, his voice losing its earlier calm. "Unknown interference, sir. It's not jamming exactly. It's more like our own systems are being convinced of things that aren't true." I did not fully understand what that meant at the time, but I understood the fear in the technician's voice. Our ships were not being attacked in any way we recognized. They were being confused, misled, turned subtly against themselves through methods our defensive doctrine had never been designed to counter. We had spent generations building shields against energy weapons and kinetic strikes. We had built almost nothing to defend against an enemy who simply made our own instruments lie to us. Within minutes, the formation began to fracture. One escort vessel drifted out of position, its navigation insisting it was somewhere it was not. Another reported a false hull breach warning so convincing that half its crew began emergency procedures before anyone realized the breach did not exist. The cruiser itself began experiencing power fluctuations that our engineers could not immediately trace to any external cause, only that every system seemed to be operating just slightly outside the parameters it should have been. Through it all, the human ship had still not moved. "They haven't fired a single weapon," I said quietly, more to myself than to anyone else in the bay. But one of the senior officers nearby heard me and turned with a look of grim understanding. "That's what makes this worse," he said. "We don't even know if what's happening to us counts as an attack by their definition. We assumed conflict meant explosions and broken hulls. We never considered that an enemy might simply unmake our confidence in our own machines." I watched the tactical display lose coherence entirely. Ship icons blinking in and out, distances reporting differently from one console to the next, until the captain finally gave the order to disengage and regroup at a safer distance. As we pulled back, I caught one final, clear reading from our sensors, before the interference swallowed it completely. The human ship had still not changed position. It had still not fired. It had done nothing that any Confederacy military doctrine would classify as an act of aggression. And yet our entire battle group had been rendered nearly useless within the span of 20 minutes. We regrouped roughly 2 hours later at a defensive position closer to the station, badly shaken but largely intact. No lives had been lost, which Director Sale noted with visible relief during the debrief, though I noticed his relief did little to settle the deeper unease in the room. Losing no lives felt less like a victory and more like a warning that had been deliberately restrained. "They could have ended us," one of the escort captains said during the briefing. "Every system we had was compromised. If they wanted us gone, we would be gone." "Then why aren't we?" Sael asked, his tone sharp with frustration rather than anger. No one had an answer, but I found myself thinking of Laura Bennett again, her calm voice delivering those 6 words without a hint of malice. I began to suspect, though I did not yet say it aloud, that the restraint we had just witnessed was not mercy. It was demonstration. They were showing us exactly how little effort it took to dismantle our confidence, and exactly how much further they were capable of going if we forced them to. 2 days passed in tense stillness. Confederacy command, far from our system, demanded explanations Sael could not fully provide. Reinforcements were promised but had not yet arrived. In the meantime, life on the station continued in a strange, suspended state. Everyone aware that something significant was happening, but unsure of what action, if any, would help. It was during this stillness that I made the decision that would change the course of my life entirely. I requested permission to attempt direct contact with the human vessel, using a small, unarmed shuttle, relying on my prior interaction with Laura Bennett as justification. I argued that a single, clearly non-threatening vessel might succeed where an entire battle group had failed to even receive a reply. Sael was hesitant, understandably so, but the alternative options were limited, and after a day of deliberation, he approved the request under strict conditions. I would carry no weapons, broadcast continuous identification, and withdraw immediately if any threatening response was detected. I will admit, sitting alone in that small shuttle as it left the station, that I was afraid, in a way I had never been afraid before. Not the abstract fear of distant danger, but the immediate physical fear of approaching something I did not understand, something that had already proven it could unravel an entire battle group without firing a single visible shot. Yet beneath that fear was something else, a growing need to understand what we were truly dealing with, because I had begun to suspect that understanding was the only tool that might actually matter in this conflict. The approach took several hours. I broadcast a continuous identification signal the entire way, along with a simple, repeated message requesting communication, careful to keep my tone calm and non-confrontational. For most of the journey, there was no response, and I began to wonder if I would simply be ignored, as the larger fleet had been. Then, when I was close enough that the human ship filled most of my viewport, a single channel opened. The voice that came through was calm, measured, and unmistakably human. Identify yourself and your purpose. I gave my name, my role, and explained that I sought understanding, not confrontation. There was a long pause before the voice responded again. You're the one who delivered the annexation notice to Brightholme. I confirmed that I was, my pulse quickening at the realization that they had already connected me to that encounter. Then you already received your answer, the voice said. You were told what would happen. You chose not to listen. I did not understand what I was being told, I admitted, deciding that honesty was my only useful tool in that moment. I would like to understand now, before more harm is done on either side. There was another pause, longer this time, before the channel shifted, and I was informed that my shuttle would be brought aboard for a direct conversation. I remember my hands trembling slightly as I followed the guidance signals toward the docking bay of a ship that, only days earlier, had reduced an entire Confederacy battle group to chaos without firing a single shot. I did not know, as I guided my small craft into that vast, quiet hangar, that I was about to witness the calm, deliberate mindset of a species that the rest of the galaxy had badly, dangerously underestimated. The hangar bay of the human ship was nothing like I expected. I had imagined something cold and mechanical, lined with weapons and warning lights, built to remind any visitor of the danger they were walking into. Instead, I found a space that was orderly, quiet, and almost plain. Crates were stacked with careful precision along one wall. A small maintenance crew worked on a damaged drone near the far corner, speaking to each other in low, unhurried voices. No one looked at me with hostility. A few glanced up with mild curiosity, the way someone might glance at an unfamiliar visitor arriving at a workplace, then return to their tasks. A man was waiting near the base of my shuttle's ramp as I disembarked. He introduced himself as Captain Owen Fletcher, commanding officer of the vessel I had just boarded. He was tall, with short gray hair, and a calm, unreadable expression that reminded me uncomfortably of Laura Bennett's face during our first meeting. He did not raise his voice. He did not posture or display any of the dominance behaviors I had been trained to expect from a victorious military commander. He simply extended a hand, which I learned later was a human gesture of peaceful greeting, and waited for me to take it. You wanted to understand, he said, once we were seated in a small briefing room off the main corridor. I'll tell you plainly then. Most species who reach us never bother to ask. They assume they already understand everything, right up until they don't. It costs nothing, and it teaches a lesson without anyone needing to bleed for it. I asked him why, if his ship was capable of such precise disruption, he had not simply destroyed the battle group outright, when by every measure I understood, doing so would have ended any further resistance immediately. His answer has stayed with me ever since. Because ending lives is not our first option, it's our last. Most species assume because we're capable of overwhelming force, we must enjoy using it. The truth is the opposite. We use exactly as much as the situation requires, and not a single measure more, until we're given no other choice. I asked him to explain what he meant by no other choice, and it was here that Captain Fletcher told me something that reshaped my entire understanding of his species. He explained, calmly and without exaggeration, that humans had spent most of their recorded history in conflict with each other, long before any of them ever left their home planet. Wars over land, wars over belief, wars over resources, fought for thousands of years across every region of their world. By the time they developed space travel, they had already developed something else alongside it, a deeply ingrained instinct for recognizing threats early, responding to them efficiently, and escalating only when restraint had clearly failed. Most species we've met, he said, organize for war the way you organize a formal ceremony. Rules, traditions, careful escalation, mutual respect for boundaries, neither side wants to cross. We don't think that way. We never had the luxury of thinking that way. When a threat becomes real, we don't wait for permission to take it seriously. We adapt immediately, and we adapt completely. I asked him about the phrase Laura Bennett had used, the words that had haunted me since the day of the annexation. I asked him plainly if humans truly believed themselves to be the most deadly species alive, and whether that belief was rooted in pride or in something else. Fletcher considered the question for a long moment before answering. "It's not pride," he said. "Pride gets people killed. It's closer to an old, painful lesson we learned the hard way, over and over, until it became part of how we think. Every time someone assumed weakness in another person, in another nation, in another group, that assumption eventually cost lives. We carry that lesson with us into everything we do now, including how we deal with outsiders. We don't say we're the most dangerous species alive because we want to be feared. We say it because history showed us, again and again, what happens when an opponent is underestimated, and we decided a long time ago that we would rather be the ones doing the underestimating in reverse." He went on to explain, in careful detail, how human military doctrine differed from what the Confederacy expected. Where Confederacy fleets relied on rigid hierarchies and centralized command structures, human forces were trained to operate effectively even when communication with command was lost entirely. Where Confederacy engagement protocols emphasized formal declarations and structured escalation, human forces were trained to respond to threats the moment they were confirmed, without waiting for ceremony. Where Confederacy strategy often assumed an enemy would behave predictably, according to established rules of engagement, human strategy assumed the opposite, and built contingencies for nearly every form of unpredictability imaginable. "You expected a battle," Fletcher said. "We gave you a lesson instead. There's a difference, even if the outcome looks similar from a distance." I asked him what would happen next, now that the Confederacy had, in his words, declared a conflict it did not fully understand. He told me, with the same unsettling calm he had shown throughout our entire conversation, that the decision was no longer entirely in human hands. Brightholm was a small colony, he said, a handful of families, a research outpost, nothing of strategic value beyond the minerals your registrars wanted. We could have let it go quietly. Many of our settlements operate independently enough that losing one wouldn't cripple us. But that's not how this works anymore. The moment your Confederacy annexed that colony by force, you didn't just take a piece of land. You demonstrated, very clearly, what your empire is willing to do to any human settlement it decides it wants. That message reached every human colony, every human ship, every human command structure within hours. And once that message spreads, the response stops being a matter of individual choice. It becomes a matter of collective necessity. I asked him, somewhat desperately, if there remained any path toward peaceful resolution, any way to undo what had already been set into motion. "There's always a path," he said, "but it isn't the one your Confederacy seems to want. Your leaders are used to negotiating from strength, offering concessions from a position of control. That won't work here. If you want this to end without further conflict, your Confederacy needs to understand something it has apparently never had to understand before. Humanity does not require your permission to defend what belongs to us, and we do not require your approval to consider any harm against our people a direct threat to be answered. The path to peace exists. It simply runs through respect, not dominance, and that is a language your empire has never needed to learn before now." I sat with his words for a long moment, trying to reconcile everything I had believed about humanity only a week earlier, with the calm, deliberate figure sitting across from me. I had expected anger. I had expected threats, displays of power meant to frighten me into compliance. Instead, I found something far more unsettling, a quiet, unwavering confidence that did not need to prove itself through aggression, because it had already proven itself through results. Before I left, I asked him one final question, the one that had been sitting at the back of my mind since the moment Laura Bennett first spoke those 6 words to me. I asked him if humanity truly believed itself capable of standing against an empire as vast as the Confederacy, with its thousands of worlds and countless resources, when humanity itself remained a single species with a single homeworld of true origin. Fletcher's answer was simple, and it was the answer that finally made me understand the full weight of what we had done. "Size has never been the deciding factor in our history," he said. "Determination has. Your Confederacy has more worlds, more ships, more resources than we do. That much is true. But you've spent generations growing comfortable, assuming your size alone guarantees your safety. We've spent our entire history learning that comfort is the first thing an enemy exploits. You didn't just provoke a single species when you took Brightholme. You provoked a species that has never once, in its long and painful history, mistaken size for strength. I returned to my shuttle in silence, escorted back through the quiet, orderly hangar by a young crew member who said little beyond polite instructions. As I left the human ship and began the long journey back toward the Confederacy station, I found myself staring out at the stars, turning Fletcher's words over and over in my mind, and understanding, with a growing and uncomfortable certainty, that whatever the Confederacy believed it had begun on Brightholme, it had badly misjudged the species it now found itself standing against. When I returned to the station, Director Sayel wasted no time pulling me into a private debrief. I relayed everything Captain Fletcher had told me, careful to keep my own opinions separate from the facts as I understood them. Sayel listened with a stillness that unsettled me more than any outburst could have, his fingers tapping slowly against the edge of his desk as I spoke. When I finished, he sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. "They expect a coalition response," he said, more to himself than to me. He was right. Within days, Confederacy Central had escalated the matter far beyond our small station. Word of the encounter spread through official channels first, then through unofficial ones, until every major Confederacy member species had heard some version of what had happened at Brightholme. The official narrative, carefully shaped by council representatives, framed the incident as an unprovoked act of aggression by a newly discovered species against lawful Confederacy expansion. Few outside our station knew the full context of what had actually occurred, and fewer still seemed interested in asking. A coalition fleet was assembled within 3 weeks, an effort that under normal circumstances would have taken months of negotiation, between member species notorious for their territorial pride and competing interests. That it came together so quickly told me something important. The Confederacy was afraid, and fear, more than diplomacy, was what finally pushed reluctant allies into cooperation. I was reassigned to the coalition flagship as a cultural liaison, my prior contact with both Laura Bennett and Captain Fletcher apparently making me valuable enough to keep close to command, despite my obvious discomfort with the role. The flagship itself was an impressive vessel, easily 10 times the size of the human ship that had disrupted our earlier battle group, escorted by dozens of warships drawn from half a dozen different Confederacy member species. Admiral Theron Vask, a decorated officer with decades of successful campaigns behind him, commanded the operation with the confident efficiency of someone who had never once faced an opponent he did not eventually defeat. I remember standing on the bridge as the coalition fleet approached the edge of human-controlled space, watching tactical displays fill with ship formations so vast they seemed to blot out the surrounding starfield. For a brief, foolish moment, I allowed myself to believe that such overwhelming force would be enough to force a swift and peaceful resolution. Surely, I thought, no single species, however capable, could withstand a coalition fleet of this size. I had forgotten, in that moment, everything Captain Fletcher had told me. The first sign of trouble came not from any visible human presence, but from within our own coalition ranks. Communication between allied fleets, which had functioned smoothly during preparation, began experiencing strange inconsistencies almost as soon as we crossed into contested territory. Orders issued by Admiral Vask arrived at Allied ships slightly altered. Small details changed in ways that created confusion rather than outright sabotage. A supply vessel was redirected to the wrong coordinates due to a transmission error no one could explain. 2 Allied destroyers nearly collided after receiving conflicting positioning data from what appeared to be a legitimate coalition source. "They're inside our communication network," a tactical officer reported, panic creeping into her otherwise controlled voice. Not breaking it, just influencing it. Small changes, things that look like normal errors. Admiral Vask ordered an immediate communication lockdown, restricting all coalition traffic to verified, encrypted channels only. It helped, but not completely. Even within the lockdown, small inconsistencies continued to appear, as if whatever system the humans were using to interfere with us had already anticipated our countermeasures before we implemented them. I thought of Captain Fletcher's words about adaptability, about a species that built contingencies for nearly every form of unpredictability imaginable, and I understood, with a growing dread, that we had walked directly into territory the humans had clearly expected us to enter. The true engagement, when it finally came, unfolded nothing like the decisive battle Admiral Vask and his staff had planned for. Rather than meeting our fleet head-on, human forces appeared in small, scattered groups, striking isolated coalition vessels that had drifted slightly out of formation due to the ongoing communication issues, then withdrawing before any organized response could be mounted. Each strike was precise, efficient, and clearly designed to disable, rather than destroy where possible, focusing on engines, weapon systems, and communication arrays, rather than crew areas. "They're not trying to wipe us out," one officer observed during a tense briefing several hours into the engagement. "They're trying to make us ineffective. Every ship they hit is still mostly intact, just unable to fight." Admiral Vask, to his credit, adapted his strategy as the engagement continued, tightening formations and prioritizing communication security over speed. But every adjustment he made seemed to be answered almost immediately by a corresponding shift in human tactics, as if our own command decisions were being anticipated before we fully committed to them. I began to suspect, and later confirmed through conversations with shaken communication officers, that the human forces were not simply reacting to our movements. They were studying our command patterns in real time, identifying the habits and assumptions baked into Confederacy military doctrine, and exploiting them with calm, methodical precision. The coalition's rigid hierarchy, which under normal circumstances ensured order and discipline, became a liability against an enemy who understood exactly how predictable that rigidity made us. Where Confederacy forces required confirmation through multiple command layers before adjusting tactics, human forces, organized in smaller independent units, adapted within minutes. Where Confederacy honor doctrine discouraged certain defensive maneuvers considered dishonorable among allied species, human forces used those very maneuvers without hesitation, having no cultural obligation to follow rules they had never agreed to. By the end of the second day, the coalition fleet had suffered no catastrophic losses in terms of lives, a fact Admiral Vask noted with the same uneasy relief Director Sale had shown after our earlier encounter. But the fleet's combat effectiveness had been reduced dramatically. Damaged engines, compromised weapon systems, and a deeply shaken sense of confidence left even the most experienced coalition officers questioning strategies that had served them reliably for generations. I was present during the emergency council Admiral Vask convened with his senior staff that evening, and I will never forget the heavy, defeated silence that filled the room as damage reports were read aloud one after another. No coalition member species had ever faced an opponent who seemed to understand their own strategies better than they did. No coalition member species had ever been forced to consider that their carefully developed military traditions, refined over centuries of conflict with each other, might simply be irrelevant against an opponent who had never agreed to play by those same rules. "They're not fighting us the way we fight," one of the Allied captains said quietly. "They're fighting us the way someone fights a fire, contain it, starve it, wait for it to burn itself out." Admiral Vask, visibly exhausted, turned to me near the end of that meeting and asked, with a tone that held none of his earlier confidence, whether I believed further engagement would change the outcome we were facing. I thought carefully before answering, remembering everything Captain Fletcher had told me aboard his ship. "I believe," I said, "that every escalation we attempt will simply teach them more about how we operate, while teaching us very little about how they operate in return. I believe continuing this path leads only to further losses, both in resources and in confidence, without bringing us any closer to the resolution we originally sought." Vask did not respond immediately, but I saw something shift in his expression, the slow, painful recognition of a strategist, realizing that the rules he had relied upon for his entire career simply did not apply here. The coalition fleet withdrew to a defensive position the following day, not in surrender, but in the kind of cautious retreat that comes when even the most confident commanders begin to understand they are facing something fundamentally different from anything they have prepared for. Word of the coalition's struggles spread quickly through Confederacy space, and with it came a shift in tone among the council that I had not expected. Where earlier communications had framed the conflict as a simple matter of restoring order, later transmissions grew increasingly focused on de-escalation, careful in their language, eager to avoid further confrontation without openly admitting the depth of the miscalculation that had brought us here. I remained aboard the coalition flagship as negotiations began, watching as proud, powerful representatives from across the Confederacy slowly came to terms with a truth I had already begun to understand myself. We had not provoked a weak, isolated species, unprepared for conflict. We had provoked a species whose entire history had shaped it into something the rest of the galaxy had simply never encountered before, an opponent who did not need superior numbers or superior technology to dismantle our confidence, only patience, precision, and an unshakable understanding of exactly how far it was willing to go. The negotiations that followed took place not on a grand Confederacy capital, as tradition usually demanded, but aboard a neutral station near the edge of human territory, chosen at human insistence rather than Confederacy preference. I found it telling that even in matters of diplomacy, humanity refused to operate on terms that were not their own, and even more telling that the Confederacy, after everything that had happened, no longer felt in any position to argue. I was asked to remain present throughout the talks, serving once again as a liaison given my prior history with both Laura Bennett and Captain Fletcher. Sitting in that conference room during the opening session, I watched representatives from a dozen Confederacy member species, leaders who had spent their careers negotiating from positions of overwhelming strength, struggle visibly with the unfamiliar experience of sitting across from someone who held the advantage instead. The human delegation was led by a woman named Colonel Grace Whitfield, calm and direct in a way that reminded me immediately of both Laura Bennett and Captain Fletcher. I began to understand, watching her speak, that this calmness was not an individual trait, but something deeply woven into human culture itself, a shared understanding that confidence did not require volume, and that strength did not require constant demonstration, once it had already been proven. "We're not here to discuss conquest," Whitfield said early in the talks, addressing the assembled Confederacy representatives with the same plain honesty Fletcher had shown me weeks earlier. "We never wanted this conflict, and we take no pride in what it cost either side. We're here because your Confederacy needs to understand something clearly, in terms that won't be forgotten or reinterpreted once this meeting ends. Human territory, human settlements, and human lives are not available for annexation, negotiation, or quiet resource extraction. That boundary is absolute, and it will remain absolute regardless of how large your empire grows around it." A representative from one of the larger Confederacy member species, a proud and traditionally dominant species among the Council, attempted early in the talks to frame the conflict as a misunderstanding born from incomplete registry information, suggesting that proper diplomatic channels, had they been followed from the beginning, would have avoided the entire situation. Whitfield's response was measured but unmistakably firm. "Your registry listed our species as Tier 3, before any of you bothered to ask what that actually meant for us. You didn't seek diplomatic channels because you didn't believe you needed to. You assumed annexation, the same way you've assumed it with every other smaller species your Confederacy has absorbed over the centuries. The only difference this time is that we refused to accept that assumption, and we made sure the cost of that refusal was clear enough that it won't be repeated." The talks continued over several long days, and I watched as the Confederacy, piece by piece, conceded terms that would have seemed unthinkable only weeks earlier. Human territory was to be formally recognized as entirely independent of Confederacy jurisdiction, with clearly defined borders that no member species would be permitted to cross without explicit human invitation. Any future interaction between humanity and the Confederacy would proceed only through direct, equal negotiation, never through the registry classifications and unilateral annexation processes that had defined Confederacy expansion for generations. Perhaps most significant, at least from where I sat, was a smaller provision added almost quietly near the end of the final agreement, a single clause stating that any future Confederacy action resulting in harm to human territory or human lives would be considered, without exception, a direct threat to humanity as a whole, warranting whatever response humanity deemed necessary, without requirement for prior declaration or formal process. I remember Admiral Vask, present for the final signing, leaning toward me quietly and asking whether I believed that clause was meant as a warning or a promise. I told him honestly that I believed it was simply a statement of fact, delivered the same calm, unembellished way every significant human statement throughout this entire conflict had been delivered, without theatrics, without exaggeration, simply truth, spoken plainly, because plain truth required nothing more. In the months that followed the formal end of hostilities, I requested reassignment away from my original registrar position, unable to return comfortably to a role built around the kind of careless expansion that had started this entire conflict. To my surprise, my request was approved alongside a new posting, one that placed me directly within a newly formed diplomatic office responsible for managing ongoing relations between the Confederacy and human territory. It was through this new role that I came to know Laura Bennett properly, not as the defiant governor of a small colony facing annexation, but as a thoughtful, measured leader who had spent years preparing her community for exactly the kind of confrontation that had eventually arrived. She told me once, during a quiet moment between formal meetings, that she had never doubted the outcome of that first encounter, not because she underestimated the Confederacy's strength, but because she understood her own people's history well enough to know exactly what they were capable of when pushed past the point of quiet acceptance. "You weren't wrong to expect compliance," she told me. "Every other species you've encountered probably gave you exactly that. We just happened to be the first one whose entire history taught us never to give it." I came to understand, over the following years, that the galaxy's perception of humanity shifted permanently after Brightholm. Where humans had once been catalogued as a primitive, manageable species barely worth serious consideration, they were now approached by every spacefaring power with a level of caution previously reserved only for the most established and powerful Confederacy members. Trade agreements were proposed carefully, respectfully, often through intermediaries well-versed in the lessons learned from the Brightholm conflict. Territorial disputes near human space were resolved through patient, equal negotiation rather than the casual unilateral decisions that had once defined Confederacy expansion. What struck me most, looking back on everything that had unfolded, was how little of it had actually required overwhelming destruction. Humanity had not conquered the Confederacy. Humanity had not sought to expand beyond its own borders, or claim territory that did not belong to it. The entire conflict, from beginning to end, had been fought not for gain, but for boundaries, for the simple, unwavering insistence that human lives and human territory deserved the same respect the Confederacy demanded for its own member species. I think often of that first day on Brightholm, standing before Laura Bennett with a signed annexation document in my hand, completely unaware of what those 6 calm words truly meant. "Congratulations," she had said. "You just declared war on the most deadly species alive." At the time, I had mistaken her calmness for weakness, her certainty for empty bravado. I understand now that her calmness was simply the natural confidence of someone who already understood exactly what her people would do, and exactly why it would be enough. The galaxy did not learn to fear humanity through cruelty or excessive force. It learned, slowly and painfully, to respect a species that fought only when necessary, restrained itself even in victory, and demonstrated, again and again, that competence and resolve could accomplish what raw power alone never could. Somewhere in human territory, I imagine new colonies are still being settled, families still building quiet, ordinary lives beneath unfamiliar stars, secure now in a galaxy that finally understands the simple truth Laura Bennett offered me so plainly on that first fateful day. Humanity never wanted to be